The October rain drummed against the windows of the suburban Chicago home as Karen Matthews folded the last of Michael's dress shirts. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read the subtle signs, the way he avoided eye contact when discussing weekend plans, the new cologne that lingered on his collar, the phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. She smoothed the crisp white cotton, remembering when she used to iron these same shirts with care, taking pride in the perfect creases. Now the routine felt mechanical, each fold a testament to a life lived on autopilot. The doorbell chimed through the quiet house. Karen glanced at the clock, 3:47 p.m. Michael wouldn't be home for hours, claiming another late meeting at the consulting firm where he'd worked for the past 15 years. Through the frosted glass, she could see the outline of a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair. Karen opened the door to find a stranger holding a manila envelope, her hands trembling slightly in the cool afternoon air. "Are you Karen Matthews?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The stranger's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. "My name is Sarah Chen. I think we need to talk." Karen's stomach tightened. Something in the woman's tone, the way she clutched that envelope like a lifeline, made her step aside and gesture toward the living room. Sarah perched on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, the same one Karen had picked out when they'd first moved to this house 12 years ago. Back then, she'd imagined family gatherings, birthday parties, Christmas mornings filled with laughter. "Mrs. Matthews, I don't know how to say this gently," Sarah began, her voice cracking. "Your husband and I have been involved for the past 8 months. The words hung in the air like smoke. Karen felt her legs give way as she sank into the armchair across from Sarah. She'd suspected, of course, but hearing it confirmed felt like a physical blow. "I didn't know he was married at first," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He told me he was divorced, that he lived alone. It wasn't until last month that I found out the truth." Karen's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. "How did you find out?" Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. "I hired a private investigator. I needed to know who Michael really was." She spread the photos across the coffee table like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. The images showed Michael and Sarah entering restaurants, walking hand in hand through Lincoln Park, embracing outside a downtown hotel. But it was the last photo that made Karen's blood run cold. Michael's key turning in the front door of her own house, Sarah close behind him. "This was taken last Thursday," Sarah said, pointing to the timestamp, "while you were at your book club." Karen remembered that evening clearly. She'd stayed late discussing the month's selection with her friends, arriving home to find Michael already asleep, or so she'd thought. The sheets had been changed, she realized now. Fresh linens on a Thursday when she typically did laundry on weekends. "He brought you here." Karen's voice was barely audible. Sarah nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. When I found out about you, I confronted him immediately. He begged me not to tell you, said he needed time to figure things out." "And what did you say?" "I told him I couldn't be part of this anymore, that you deserved to know." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He's been calling me non-stop, showing up at my apartment. Yesterday he told me he was going to leave you, that we could be together openly." Karen's mind raced. Yesterday, Michael had seemed unusually affectionate, bringing her flowers and suggesting they plan a weekend getaway. Had that been his way of saying goodbye? "Why are you telling me this?" Karen asked. "Because I have a sister," Sarah said, "and if someone was doing this to her, I'd want them to know." She gathered the photos back into the envelope. "Also because Michael isn't the man either of us thought he was." The front door slammed shut, followed by Michael's familiar voice calling out, "Karen, I'm home early!" Both women froze. Karen could hear his footsteps in the hallway, the rustle of his jacket being hung in the closet, the clink of his keys hitting the ceramic bowl by the entrance. "In here," Karen called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Michael appeared in the doorway, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and panic in the span of 3 seconds. His usually composed demeanor cracked as he took in the scene, his wife and his mistress sitting across from each other, the manila envelope on the coffee table between them. "What's going on here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Karen stood slowly, feeling years of suppressed anger crystallizing into something sharp and focused. "Sarah was just telling me about your relationship, all of it." Michael's face flushed red. "Karen, let me explain." "Explain what? How you brought her into our bed, how you lied to both of us." Karen's voice grew stronger with each word. "How you've been living a double life for 8 months. It's not what you think," Michael said, moving toward her. "Sarah and I, it's complicated." "Don't." Sarah stood up, her own composure returning. "Don't make this worse than it already is." The three of them stood in the living room, 23 years of marriage hanging in the balance. Outside, the rain continued its relentless rhythm against the windows, as if the sky itself was mourning the death of Karen's carefully constructed life. Karen looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man who had promised to love and honor her, who had held her hand through her mother's funeral, who had celebrated every anniversary with renewed vows of devotion, was a fiction. "I want you to leave," she said quietly. "Karen, please, both of you. I want you both to leave. Now." Michael started to protest, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "She's right. We should go." As they moved toward the door, Karen called out, "Michael." He turned, hope flickering in his eyes. "Don't come back tonight. Find somewhere else to sleep." The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Karen alone in the house that suddenly felt too big and too empty. She sank back into her armchair and picked up one of the photos Sarah had left behind. Michael and Sarah laughing together at some restaurant she didn't recognize. She studied his face in the image, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the same expression he'd worn on their wedding day. Had any of it been real? Or had she been married to a performance for over 2 decades? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times. Karen realized she was still holding the photo, her fingerprints joining the evidence of her husband's betrayal. She set it down carefully and walked to the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making tea. As the kettle heated, she stared out at the backyard where she'd planted roses 3 springs ago. Michael had complained about the cost, but she'd insisted, dreaming of summer mornings spent tending to them together. Now they stood dormant in their beds, preparing for winter's harsh embrace. The whistle of the kettle jolted her back to the present. She poured the boiling water over a chamomile tea bag and watched the pale liquid gradually deepen to amber. Such a simple transformation, yet it reminded her that change, once begun, couldn't be undone. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Michael. "Karen, I'm at the Marriott downtown. We need to talk. I love you." She deleted the message without responding and turned off her phone. Tomorrow she would need to make decisions about lawyers, about dividing assets, about telling their families and friends. But tonight she needed silence. She carried her tea to the living room and sat in Michael's usual spot on the sofa, something she'd rarely done in all their years together. From this angle she could see the family photos arranged on the mantelpiece, their wedding day, vacations, anniversaries, all the milestones of a life built on what she now understood to be lies. But as she sipped her tea and listened to the rain, Karen felt something unexpected stirring within her. Beneath the hurt and betrayal, beneath the shock and anger, was something else entirely: relief. For months she'd felt like she was living in a fog, going through the motions of a marriage that felt increasingly hollow. She'd attributed it to middle age, to the natural evolution of long-term relationships. Now she understood it had been her intuition, trying to tell her what her heart hadn't wanted to accept. The truth, painful as it was, had set something free inside her. For the first time in years, Karen Matthews felt truly awake. Karen woke at 5:30 a.m., earlier than she had in months. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp autumn morning that filtered through the bedroom curtains in golden streaks. For a moment, she forgot about the previous day's revelations. Then reality crashed back with brutal clarity. She showered and dressed with unusual care, selecting a navy blue blazer and matching skirt, the outfit she wore to important meetings at the nonprofit where she worked as a program coordinator. Today felt like it required armor. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from Michael and a string of increasingly desperate text messages. She scrolled through them while sipping her coffee. "Please answer. We can work this out. I made a mistake. You're the only one I've ever really loved. Don't throw away 23 years over this. Sarah means nothing to me. It was just physical." The last message, sent at 3:17 a.m., simply read, "I'm coming home tomorrow to get my things. We need to talk face to face." Karen set down her phone and walked to the window overlooking their quiet suburban street. Mrs. Patterson was already tending to her garden next door, her silver hair catching the morning light. The elderly woman had been widowed for 5 years, yet she seemed more content than Karen had felt in ages. An idea began forming in Karen's mind. She retrieved her laptop and spent the next hour researching Illinois divorce law, asset division, and legal separation procedures. The clinical language of legal websites couldn't capture the emotional devastation, but they offered something more valuable: a roadmap forward. By noon, she had contacted 3 divorce attorneys and scheduled consultations for the following week. She also called her sister Lisa in Denver, knowing she needed at least one person in her corner who would understand the full scope of what she was facing. "Karen, it's the middle of a workday. What's wrong?" Lisa's voice immediately shifted from casual to concerned. "Michael's been having an affair." The silence stretched for several seconds. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. How did you find out?" Karen explained about Sarah's visit, the photographs, the realization that Michael had brought another woman into their home. As she spoke, she felt her resolve strengthening rather than wavering. "What can I do?" Lisa asked. "Do you want me to fly out there?" "Not yet, but I might need you soon." Karen paused. "Lisa, I'm not just angry, I'm humiliated. The thought of him bringing her here into our bed. You have every right to be furious. What are you going to do?" Karen looked around the living room, where she'd confronted the truth about her marriage. "I'm going to make sure he understands exactly what he's lost." That afternoon, Karen drove to the local hardware store and purchased several items that raised no eyebrows individually, but would serve her purposes perfectly. She also stopped by the photography shop where she'd had family portraits taken over the years. "Mrs. Matthews?" The owner, an elderly man named George, greeted her warmly. "What can I do for you today?" "I need some enlargements made. Rush job, if possible." She handed him a USB drive containing the photos Sarah had left behind. "Can you have these ready by tomorrow morning?" George examined the files on his computer screen. His expression shifted slightly as he realized what he was looking at, but his professionalism never wavered. "Of course. What size did you need?" 8 by 10 should be perfect." As she left the shop, Karen's phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, but she let it go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to hear his voice, to risk having her newfound clarity clouded by his explanations and promises. The voicemail was predictably contrite. "Karen, I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but please don't make any permanent decisions while you're upset. I'm coming home tomorrow at 6 to get some clothes and to talk. I love you more than you'll ever know." Karen played the message twice, not out of sentimentality, but to fuel the fire of her determination. The casual way he assumed he could dictate the terms of their reunion, the presumption that his love could somehow erase 8 months of betrayal, it crystallized her resolve. She spent the evening researching Sarah Chen online. It didn't take long to piece together the basics. 28 years old, marketing coordinator at a tech startup, recently moved to Chicago from San Francisco. Her social media profiles showed a woman who appeared confident and successful, certainly not someone who seemed desperate enough to settle for a married man's lies. Karen found herself wondering what Michael had told Sarah about their marriage. Had he painted Karen as cold and distant? Had he claimed they were already separated, just waiting for the paperwork to be finalized? The thought of being reduced to a caricature in her own life story made her jaw clench. As she prepared for bed that night, Karen made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of sleeping in the guest room as she'd initially planned, she stripped the sheets from the master bed, the same sheets Sarah had likely lain on, and remade it with fresh linens. She would not be driven from her own bedroom by the ghosts of her husband's betrayal. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of wind against the windows, reminded her of how alone she truly was. 23 years of sharing a bed with someone, of synchronized breathing and whispered conversations in the dark, couldn't be erased in a single night. Around midnight, she heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the bedroom window, she could see Michael's BMW parked at the curb. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes before finally driving away. Karen watched his taillights disappear around the corner and felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that he'd respected her wishes, disappointment that he hadn't tried harder, and underneath it all, a growing sense of her own power. The next morning brought renewed purpose. Karen dressed in jeans and a comfortable sweater, clothes that would allow her to work efficiently. She had less than 8 hours before Michael's promised return, and she intended to make the most of them. First, she picked up the enlarged photographs from George's shop. The images were crisp and clear, documenting Michael's deception with painful clarity. She selected the most damning ones and arranged them carefully on the dining room table, where they would be impossible to miss. Next, she visited the bank where she and Michael held their joint accounts. The balance was substantial, Michael's salary combined with her own steady income and years of careful saving. She withdrew exactly half and transferred it to a new individual account, leaving a clear paper trail that would satisfy any future legal requirements. Her final stop was the locksmith. While changing the locks might seem dramatic, Karen realized it was a necessary boundary. Michael had forfeited his right to come and go as he pleased when he'd chosen to bring Sarah into their home. By late afternoon, everything was in place. The photographs were displayed like evidence in a courtroom. The locks had been changed, and Karen had the only keys. She'd also prepared a simple dinner, Michael's favorite pot roast, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as a reminder of everything he was giving up. At exactly 5:55 p.m., she heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, she watched Michael approach the front door with the confidence of a man returning to his own home. She waited for the sound of his key in the lock, for the moment of confusion when it wouldn't turn. The doorbell rang 30 seconds later. Karen opened the door to find her husband standing on the porch, with his key in his hand, bewilderment written across his face. "The locks," she said simply. "I changed them." Michael's confusion shifted to irritation. "Karen, this is still my house too. You can't just—" "I can and I did." She stepped aside to let him enter. "Your things are packed and waiting in the living room." As Michael walked through the house he'd called home for 12 years, Karen watched his face change. He noticed the photographs first, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw the enlarged images of his double life displayed like an art exhibition. "Jesus, Karen, was this really necessary? I thought you should see yourself clearly, the way I'm seeing you now." He picked up one of the photos, the image of him and Sarah entering their house, and studied it as if seeing it for the first time. "This doesn't look like what you think it does." "Then what does it look like, Michael? Help me understand." "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness that got out of hand." He set the photo down carefully. "But it's over now. Sarah and I are done." "Because she told me about you, or because you were ready to end it?" The question hung in the air between them. Michael's silence was answer enough. Karen walked to the dining room and gestured toward the table where she'd laid out dinner for two, complete with candles and their wedding china. "I made your favorite. I thought we should have one last meal together." The gesture was simultaneously intimate and devastating. Michael sat down across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his wine glass. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said. "But it did happen. For 8 months you made the choice every single day to lie to me, to betray our marriage, to bring another woman into our bed." Karen cut her pot roast with surgical precision. "So now I'm making choices too." "What kind of choices?" Karen met his eyes across the table. "The kind that will ensure you never forget what you threw away." As they ate in tense silence, Michael occasionally attempted conversation, memories of their early years together, promises about counseling and working through their problems, apologies that sounded rehearsed rather than heartfelt. Karen listened without responding, filing away each word as evidence of how little he understood about what he'd done to their marriage. Finally, Michael pushed his plate away and leaned forward. "Karen, I know I've hurt you terribly, but we can get past this. Other couples have survived affairs. We can too." "Do you love her?" Karen asked. The directness of the question caught him off guard. "That's not—" "It's complicated. It's actually very simple. Do you love Sarah Chen?" Michael's jaw worked as he struggled with his answer. "I care about her, but that's not what I asked." "Yes," he said finally. "I think I do." Karen nodded, feeling oddly grateful for his honesty. "Then you need to leave. Tonight." "Karen, please, your suitcases are by the door. I've already spoken to a lawyer." She stood up and began clearing the dishes. "You can reach me through my attorney from now on." As Michael gathered his belongings and prepared to leave the house where he'd lived for over a decade, Karen felt a strange sense of ceremony. She was witnessing the end of one life and the beginning of another. At the door, Michael turned back one final time. "I hope someday you can forgive me." "Maybe," Karen said, "but I'll never forget." After his car disappeared into the darkness, Karen locked the new deadbolt and leaned against the door. The house felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if it too was ready for whatever came next. She looked at the photographs still scattered across the dining room table and made another decision. Tomorrow she would take them down and put them away. But tonight, They would remain as a reminder that some betrayals were too deep to forgive and some truths too important to ignore. 3 weeks later, Karen sat in attorney Rebecca Walsh's downtown office, reviewing the preliminary divorce papers that would legally end her 23-year marriage. The autumn sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table, covered with documents that reduced decades of shared life to columns of numbers and legal terminology. "The discovery phase has revealed some interesting information," Rebecca said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she opened a thick manila folder. "Your husband has been quite busy financially." Karen looked up from the property division worksheet she'd been reviewing. "What do you mean? Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, jewelry purchases, all charged to your joint credit card over the past 8 months? The total comes to approximately $18,000. Rebecca slid a stack of credit card statements across the table. He wasn't exactly discreet about his affair expenses. Karen examined the charges with growing incredulity. Dinner at the Signature Room at the 95th, weekend stays at the Peninsula Chicago, a diamond bracelet from Tiffany & Co., purchased just 2 weeks before Sarah had appeared at her door. Michael had been funding his double life with their shared resources, money that should have gone toward their retirement or household expenses. "Can we recover this?" Karen asked. "Absolutely. Illinois courts don't look kindly on marital assets being used to fund extramarital relationships. We'll petition for reimbursement, plus interest." Rebecca made a note on her legal pad. "There's something else. Your husband's attorney contacted me yesterday with a settlement offer." Karen set down the credit card statements. "Already? He's eager to avoid a lengthy court battle. Apparently, he's concerned about how this might affect his career if it becomes public." Rebecca pulled out another document. "He's offering you the house, 60% of the retirement accounts, and spousal support for 5 years. What's the catch? He wants to keep his full pension and his partnership stake in the consulting firm. He's also requesting joint custody of your personal property and wants the proceedings sealed." Karen laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "He cheats on me for 8 months, spends our money on another woman, and then wants to protect his reputation." "That's essentially correct." Rebecca leaned forward. "Karen, I have to ask, do you want to consider this offer? It's actually quite generous in terms of the financial settlement." Karen thought about the question seriously. The offered settlement would provide her with financial security and a quick resolution. She could move forward with her life, put the humiliation behind her, and start fresh without the public spectacle of a contested divorce. But then she remembered the photographs Sarah had shown her, the casual way Michael had brought his mistress into their bedroom, the 8 months of lies told with practiced ease. Some violations couldn't be quietly settled away. "No," Karen said firmly. "I want a full accounting of his assets, including the consulting firm, and I want this on the record. He doesn't get to hide behind sealed proceedings." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "I was hoping you'd say that. In my experience, spouses who cheat and then demand privacy usually have more to hide." As Karen left the attorney's office, her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Lisa. "How did the meeting go?" Instead of responding immediately, Karen walked the few blocks to Millennium Park, needing space to process everything she'd learned. The late October afternoon was crisp and clear, with families and couples strolling along the pathways despite the cooling temperature. She found a bench near Cloud Gate and watched tourists pose for photos with the reflective sculpture. Their laughter and excitement felt foreign to her now, like observing life from behind glass. When had she last felt genuinely happy? The question troubled her because she couldn't remember. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Michael's name appeared on the screen the first time he'd called in over a week. "Hello, Michael." "Karen, we need to talk." "Not through lawyers, just the two of us." His voice sounded strained, older somehow. "This is getting out of hand." "Is it?" "From my perspective, it's just getting honest. The financial discovery requests, the demands for business records. You're trying to destroy me." Karen felt a flicker of anger. "I'm trying to get what I'm legally entitled to. If that feels destructive, maybe you should have considered the consequences before you decided to cheat." "I made a mistake, Karen." "A terrible mistake. But this vindictive approach isn't like you. You're right. The old Karen would have quietly accepted whatever settlement you offered, grateful just to avoid conflict." She watched a young couple walk past, their hands intertwined, their future still unwritten, but that Karen was married to a man she thought she could trust. "You can still trust me. We can rebuild with Sarah, Or have you already moved on to someone else? The silence stretched long enough to provide her answer. I see, Karen said. Well, at least you're consistent. That's not fair. Sarah and I broke up after she told you about us. I'm alone now, Karen, completely alone. Then you understand how I've felt for the past 8 months while you were living a lie. After ending the call, Karen sat in the park until the sun began to set, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of orange and gold. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago, dutiful, accommodating, willing to overlook small slights to maintain peace. That woman felt like a stranger now. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. Mrs. Matthews, this is Sarah Chen. I know this is inappropriate, but I felt I should tell you something important. Can we meet? Karen stared at the message for several minutes before responding, Tomorrow, 2 p.m., the Starbucks on Michigan Avenue near the Art Institute. The next afternoon, Karen arrived early and claimed a table in the back corner where they could speak privately. Sarah appeared exactly on time, looking nervous and drawn, a far cry from the composed woman who had delivered the devastating news 3 weeks earlier. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Sarah said, settling into the chair across from Karen. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. What do you want to tell me? Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. Michael has been calling me constantly since we broke up. He's desperate, Karen. Desperate enough to make promises I don't think he can keep. What kind of promises? He told me he's going to fight the divorce, that he'll find a way to keep the house and his business interests. He said once this blows over, he'll have enough money for us to start fresh somewhere else. Karen felt her blood chill. He's still planning a future with you. I've told him repeatedly that we're over, that I want nothing more to do with him. But he won't listen. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Yesterday, he showed up at my apartment with a key. He said he'd made copies of my keys months ago, that he considered my place his home too. The revelation hit Karen like a physical blow. Michael had been playing both women, maintaining backup plans and escape routes throughout his deception. Even now, facing the consequences of his actions, he was still scheming and manipulating. Why are you telling me this? Karen asked. Because I realized something after I told you the truth about our affair. Michael never loved either of us the way we deserved. He loves the idea of having options, of being desired by multiple women, of never having to fully commit to anyone. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Karen a series of text messages. These are from the past week alone. Karen scrolled through the desperate, increasingly erratic messages. Michael alternately declared his love for Sarah and blamed her for destroying his marriage. He promised her a better life while simultaneously plotting to minimize his divorce settlement. The messages painted a picture of a man unraveling, losing control of the narrative he'd carefully constructed. He's not the man either of us thought we knew, Sarah said, and I think he's dangerous when he's desperate. Karen looked up from the phone. Dangerous? How? He knows where I work, where I live, my daily routine. He has keys to my apartment. And now he's facing a divorce that could cost him everything. Sarah leaned forward. Karen, I think you should be careful. If he's willing to stalk me, what might he do to you? As Karen walked home from the coffee shop, Sarah's words echoed in her mind. She'd been focused on the legal and financial aspects of the divorce, treating it like a business transaction to be resolved through proper channels. But Sarah was right. She'd been thinking like the woman she used to be, not the woman she was becoming. That evening, she called Rebecca Walsh's office and left a voicemail requesting additional security measures and a restraining order if necessary. She also contacted a home security company to install cameras and a monitoring system. But most importantly, she opened her laptop and began researching something that would have been unthinkable to her just a month earlier. If Michael wanted to play games with concealed assets and hidden agendas, she would show him what real consequence looked like. The Chicago Tribune's investigative reporting desk was always interested in stories about professional misconduct and ethical violations. A cheating spouse might be a personal matter, but a partner in a consulting firm who used company resources for personal affairs and potentially misappropriated client funds, that was news. Karen spent hours crafting an email to the newspaper's tip line, attaching copies of credit card statements, hotel receipts, and expense reports that Rebecca's discovery process had uncovered. She included a detailed timeline of Michael's deceptions and a comprehensive list of his business contacts and clients. Before hitting send, she paused and read the message one final time. Once she submitted this information, there would be no going back. Michael's career would likely be destroyed, his professional reputation ruined, his partnership stake worthless. She thought about the 23 years they'd spent together, the good times before the lies began. She remembered the man she'd married, the promises they'd made to each other, the life they'd built from nothing. Then she thought about Sarah's fear, about Michael's continued manipulations, about the $18,000 he'd spent on another woman using their shared money. She thought about all the nights she'd lain awake wondering why her marriage felt hollow, not knowing that her instincts were screaming warnings her conscious mind refused to hear. Karen clicked send. Within hours, her phone was ringing with calls from reporters wanting to verify information and asking for interviews. She declined to speak on the record, but confirmed that all the documentation was authentic and obtained through legal discovery proceedings. 2 days later, the Tribune published a front-page story titled "Local Consulting Firm Under Investigation for Financial Irregularities." Michael's name was mentioned prominently, along with details about his use of company credit cards for personal expenses and his violation of the firm's ethics policies regarding client relationships. By noon that day, Michael's partnership had been terminated, and he was facing potential criminal charges for misappropriation of funds. Karen's phone exploded with calls from family members, friends, and neighbors who had read the article. But the call that mattered most came from Rebecca Walsh. "Karen, you need to know that Michael's attorney has withdrawn from the case. Apparently, he can no longer afford legal representation. He's also agreed to all our terms for the divorce settlement, including full disclosure of assets and an uncontested proceeding." Karen hung up the phone and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the garden where her roses were preparing for winter dormancy. In the spring, they would bloom again, stronger for having survived the cold season. She realized that she was already looking forward to spring. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning in November, while Karen was reviewing job applications at the kitchen table. She'd decided to leave her position at the non-profit to start fresh, perhaps finding work that felt more meaningful after everything she'd been through. "Mrs. Matthews, this is Detective Rodriguez with the Chicago Police Department. We need to speak with you about your husband, Michael Matthews." Karen's coffee cup stopped midway to her lips. "What about him?" "There's been an incident. Could you come down to the station this afternoon?" 2 hours later, Karen sat in a sterile interview room across from Detective Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. The detective slid a manila folder across the metal table between them. "Mrs. Matthews, we've arrested your husband on charges of stalking and criminal trespass. Last night, he was found inside Ms. Sarah Chen's apartment without permission." Karen opened the folder to find police photos of Michael in handcuffs, his usually perfect appearance disheveled and wild-eyed. There were also images of Sarah's apartment, overturned furniture, broken picture frames, clothes scattered across the floor. "Is Sarah okay?" Karen asked, surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. "Physically, yes. She came home from work to find Mr. Matthews in her bedroom, going through her personal belongings. When she confronted him, he became aggressive and destructive." Detective Rodriguez pulled out another document. "This isn't his first visit. Building security cameras show him entering the property at least 6 times over the past 2 weeks." Karen studied the photos more carefully. Michael's face showed a desperate rage she'd never seen before, as if the controlled facade he'd maintained for decades had finally cracked completely. "Ms. Chen mentioned that you two have been in contact," the detective continued. "She thought you should know what happened, especially given your ongoing divorce proceedings. What will happen to him now?" "He's being held on $50,000 bail. The stalking charge is a felony, and combined with his recent professional troubles," Detective Rodriguez shrugged, "his attorney will probably recommend a plea bargain." As Karen left the police station, she felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing Michael face real consequences for his actions, but also a disturbing realization about how little she'd actually known the man she'd been married to for over 2 decades. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Can we meet? There's more you need to know." They met at the same Starbucks where Sarah had warned Karen about Michael's increasingly erratic behavior. This time Sarah looked exhausted but relieved, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you for going to the police," Karen said as they settled into their chairs. "I should have done it sooner, but I wanted to tell you something else. Something I discovered when I was going through my apartment after the break-in. Sarah pulled out a small notebook from her purse. Michael kept detailed records of our relationship. Times, dates, what we did, what I said. Almost like he was documenting evidence. Karen flipped through the notebook, reading Michael's careful handwriting, describing intimate moments and private conversations with clinical detachment. It felt voyeuristic and disturbing, like reading the field notes of a scientist studying specimens. "There's more," Sarah said. "The notebook goes back further than our 8-month affair. There are entries about other women, going back years." The revelation hit Karen like cold water. She found entries dating back 5 years, describing brief encounters and longer relationships with women whose names she didn't recognize. Michael had been systematically unfaithful throughout their marriage, carefully documenting each betrayal like a collector cataloging acquisitions. "Amy Kellerman, March 2021 to August 2021, Karen read aloud. "Jennifer Walsh, October 2020 to February 2021. Laura Santos." She looked up at Sarah. "He's been doing this for years. The really disturbing part is how he writes about all of you, us, like we were experiments or projects rather than people." Sarah pointed to a particular entry. "Look at this one about you." Karen found the page and read Michael's assessment of their marriage. Kay becoming suspicious about late meetings. Need to plan romantic gesture to maintain domestic stability. Flowers and weekend getaway suggestions should suffice. Physical intimacy declining but manageable through other outlets. The clinical coldness of his language made Karen's skin crawl. Her marriage, her emotions, her trust, all of it had been nothing more than a management problem for Michael to solve while he pursued his real interests elsewhere. "How long have you known about this notebook?" Karen asked. "I found it hidden in his jacket pocket during one of his visits to my apartment. I photographed all the pages before putting it back." Sarah showed Karen her phone, scrolled through dozens of images. "I was planning to confront him about it, but then he started getting violent and erratic." Karen studied the photos, noting the methodical way Michael had organized his deceptions. Each woman was assigned a code name, each relationship carefully scheduled around his marriage and work obligations. He'd been living multiple lives with the precision of a project manager. "There's something else," Sarah said hesitantly. "Some of the women in that notebook. I think he might have been blackmailing them." "What do you mean?" Sarah scrolled to a particular page and enlarged it. "Look at this entry about someone called Subject L. He writes about securing additional leverage and insurance against exposure. Then there are references to photographs and maintaining cooperation." Karen felt sick. The man she'd shared a bed with for over 2 decades wasn't just a serial cheater. He was a predator who documented his conquests and potentially used them for leverage. "We need to take this to the police," Karen said. "I already have. Detective Rodriguez said they're expanding the investigation. If Michael was blackmailing these other women, it could be part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior." As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Sarah grabbed Karen's arm. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry for my part in hurting you, but I'm also sorry for what you're discovering about your marriage. No one deserves to find out they've been living with a stranger." That evening, Karen sat in her living room with a glass of wine and Michael's notebook spread out on the coffee table. She'd made copies of all the pages, organizing them chronologically to create a timeline of her husband's secret life. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its consistency. Michael would identify a target, usually a woman in a vulnerable situation, recently divorced or new to the city. He would pursue them with intense focus, lavishing them with attention and expensive gifts. Once the relationship was established, he would begin creating insurance, compromising photos, recorded conversations, or information that could damage their careers or reputations. When he was ready to move on to a new target, he would use this leverage to ensure their silence about their affair. Several entries referenced women who continued to send him money or provide him with information about their employers long after their relationships had ended. Karen realized she was looking at evidence of a sophisticated manipulation scheme that had been operating for years. Michael hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been running what amounted to a criminal enterprise, using his charm and apparent respectability to exploit vulnerable women. Her phone rang, interrupting her research. Rebecca Walsh's name appeared on the screen. "Karen, I just heard from the prosecutor's office. They want to meet with us tomorrow about Michael's case. Apparently, your divorce proceedings have uncovered evidence that's relevant to their criminal investigation. What kind of evidence? The financial records we subpoenaed show patterns of cash withdrawals and unexplained transfers that coincide with the relationships documented in that notebook. They think he might have been running an extortion scheme. Karen felt a strange sense of vindication mixed with horror. Her decision to pursue an aggressive divorce strategy, to demand full financial disclosure, and reject Michael's attempts at a quiet settlement, had inadvertently exposed what appeared to be years of criminal activity. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "The police have been contacting the other women mentioned in the notebook. 3 of them have agreed to press charges for extortion and blackmail. Michael's bail has been revoked, and he's being held pending a grand jury investigation." After ending the call, Karen walked to the kitchen and poured herself another glass of wine. She looked around the house that had been her home for 12 years, the place where she'd built what she thought was a life with someone she thought she knew. Every room held memories that she was now forced to re-examine through the lens of Michael's deception. The romantic dinners he'd prepared. Had he been practicing techniques learned with other women? The expensive jewelry he'd given her for anniversaries, had it been purchased with money extorted from his victims? The times he'd been tender and loving, had those moments been genuine or just another form of manipulation to maintain her cooperation? The doorbell rang, startling her from her dark thoughts. Through the peephole, she could see Mrs. Patterson from next door, holding a covered dish. "I brought you some lasagna, dear," the elderly woman said when Karen opened the door. "I've been reading about Michael in the papers. I thought you might not feel like cooking." Karen accepted the dish gratefully, touched by the simple kindness of the gesture. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" As they sat at the kitchen table, Mrs. Patterson studied Karen with the shrewd eyes of someone who had lived long enough to recognize pain in all its forms. "How are you holding up, really?" the older woman asked. "I don't know," Karen admitted. "I keep discovering things about my marriage, about Michael, that make me question everything. Did I know him at all? Was any of it real?" Mrs. Patterson patted Karen's hand with gentle firmness. "The love you felt was real, dear. The life you built was real. The fact that he was lying doesn't make your feelings false. But how could I have been so blind? How could I live with someone for over 20 years and not know what he was really like? Because you trusted him. Because you chose to see the best in him. Those aren't character flaws, Karen. They're the qualities that make you human." Mrs. Patterson sipped her tea thoughtfully. "The question now isn't what you missed, but what you're going to do with what you've learned." After her neighbor left, Karen sat alone in her kitchen and considered that question seriously. What was she going to do with everything she'd learned? How did someone rebuild a life after discovering that their entire foundation had been built on lies? She thought about the women whose names were written in Michael's notebook, the victims of his manipulation and extortion. She thought about Sarah, young and trusting, who had been drawn into Michael's web through no fault of her own. She thought about herself, the dutiful wife who had spent years making excuses for her husband's absences and peculiar behaviors without realizing she was enabling a criminal enterprise. For the first time since Sarah had appeared at her door with those devastating photographs, Karen felt a sense of clarity about her future. She wasn't just divorcing a cheating husband, she was helping to expose a predator who had hurt multiple women over many years. Tomorrow she would meet with the prosecutors and provide them with every piece of evidence she'd uncovered during the divorce proceedings. She would testify if necessary, speak publicly if it would help other victims come forward. She would use her pain as fuel for something meaningful. Michael had spent years carefully constructing false identities and elaborate deceptions. Now Karen would help tear down those lies and expose the truth, not just for her own healing, but for the protection of other women who might otherwise become his victims. As she prepared for bed that night, Karen realized that somewhere in the process of discovering the worst about her husband, she had also discovered something important about herself. She was stronger than she'd known, more resilient than she'd believed, and capable of turning betrayal into purpose. The woman who had opened the door to Sarah Chen 6 weeks ago would have been destroyed by these revelations, but the woman she was becoming could handle the truth, all of it, and use it to build something better. The Cook County Courthouse buzzed with activity on the morning of Michael's preliminary hearing. Karen sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, surrounded by 5 other women whose lives had been disrupted by her soon-to-be ex-husband's elaborate schemes. Detective Rodriguez had introduced them the previous week, during a group meeting at the police station. There was Jennifer Walsh, a recently divorced teacher who had met Michael at a coffee shop near her school, Amy Kellerman, a marketing executive who had relocated to Chicago for a new job and found herself isolated and vulnerable, Laura Santos, a single mother struggling to rebuild her life after an abusive relationship. Each woman's story followed a similar pattern. Michael would present himself as successful, charming, and emotionally available. He would sweep them off their feet with expensive dates and thoughtful gestures, then gradually introduce them to more intimate settings where he could document compromising situations. When the relationships ended, he would use photographs, recorded conversations, or personal information to maintain control. "I gave him $5,000 last year," Jennifer whispered to Karen as they waited for the proceedings to begin. "He said it was a temporary loan to help with a business deal. When I asked for it back, he reminded me about some photos he'd taken during a weekend getaway." Karen squeezed the younger woman's hand. "You don't have to be ashamed. He manipulated all of us." The courtroom fell silent as Michael was escorted in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Karen barely recognized the disheveled, hollow-eyed man as the confident professional she'd been married to for over 2 decades. His usual pristine appearance had been replaced by stubble, disheveled hair, and the haunted look of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. His court-appointed attorney, a harried public defender named James Morrison, looked unprepared and overwhelmed. Michael's expensive legal team had abandoned him when the retainer funds dried up and additional criminal charges mounted. Assistant District Attorney Patricia Chen, no relation to Sarah, stood to present the state's case. "Your Honor, the defendant stands accused of multiple felonies including stalking, extortion, blackmail, and fraud. Over the past 5 years, Mr. Matthews operated a sophisticated scheme targeting vulnerable women, exploiting their trust for both personal gratification and financial gain." She outlined the evidence methodically. The notebook documenting his conquests, financial records showing unexplained cash deposits totaling over $40,000, testimony from 6 victims, and digital evidence including photographs and recorded conversations stored on encrypted devices found in his apartment. The defendant used his position of apparent respectability, his marriage, his professional status, his community standing, as cover for predatory behavior that destroyed the lives and financial security of multiple victims. Michael's attorney offered a weak defense, arguing that the relationships had been consensual and that any financial exchanges were loans between adults. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Judge Patricia Williams seemed unimpressed by the attempts to minimize Michael's actions. "Mr. Matthews," the judge said, addressing him directly, "you are accused of using systematic deception and manipulation to exploit women who trusted you. The court finds sufficient evidence to bind you over for trial on all charges." Bail was set at $500,000, effectively ensuring Michael would remain in custody until trial. As he was led away, his eyes found Karen's in the gallery. She saw no remorse there, only anger and what looked like blame, as if she were somehow responsible for his downfall. After the hearing, the victims gathered outside the courthouse with ADA Chen and Detective Rodriguez. The media had picked up the story, and reporters were asking for statements about the case that had exposed what prosecutors were calling one of the most elaborate romance fraud schemes in Chicago's recent history. "I want other women to know they're not alone," Amy Kellerman told the cameras. "This man was a predator who used our loneliness and trust against us. If you've been victimized by someone like this, please come forward." Karen declined to speak to the media, but found herself surrounded by the other victims, women who had become an unexpected support network through their shared trauma. "How are you handling all this?" Laura Santos asked as they walked away from the courthouse. "I mean, you were married to him. This has to be devastating in a different way." Karen considered the question carefully. "It is devastating, but it's also liberating. For years, I felt like something was wrong with our marriage, like I was failing somehow. Now I understand it was never about me." 2 weeks later, Karen sat in her divorce attorney's office for what Rebecca Walsh assured her would be their final meeting. The criminal charges against Michael had simplified the divorce proceedings considerably. When one spouse is facing multiple felonies, asset division becomes much more straightforward. "The house is yours, free and clear," Rebecca explained, sliding documents across her desk. "All retirement accounts, investments and savings will be transferred to your name." Michael's share of the consulting firm partnership has been forfeited due to the criminal charges. What about the money he extorted from those other women? That's being handled through the criminal restitution process. The court has ordered him to pay back everything, though collecting will be difficult given his current circumstances. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Karen, you've been through something extraordinary. Most people discovering this level of betrayal would be completely broken. How are you doing, really? Karen looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, thinking about how much her life had changed since Sarah Chen had appeared at her door with those photographs. I'm angry, she said honestly. I'm hurt. I feel foolish for not seeing the signs earlier, but I also feel free. Free how? For the first time in years, I don't have to pretend everything is fine. I don't have to make excuses for Michael's behavior or wonder why our marriage felt so hollow. I know the truth, and the truth, as awful as it is better than living a lie. That evening, Karen hosted dinner for the group of women who had become her unlikely support system. They gathered in her dining room, the same room where she'd confronted Michael with Sarah's photographs, sharing a meal and stories of how they were rebuilding their lives. Jennifer Walsh had started therapy and joined a support group for fraud victims. Amy Kellerman was dating someone new, a colleague who knew about her experience with Michael and supported her healing process. Laura Santos had used the publicity from the case to launch a non-profit organization helping other women recognize and escape manipulative relationships. I've been thinking about something, Sarah said as they cleared the dinner dishes. Michael chose all of us because he thought we were vulnerable, isolated, easy targets. But look at us now. Karen looked around the table at these strong, resilient women who had transformed their trauma into purpose. What do you mean? He thought he was clever, documenting everything, keeping records of his conquests. But those same records became the evidence that brought him down. His need to control and catalogue us became his downfall. Amy raised her wineglass. To surviving Michael Matthews. To doing more than surviving, Laura corrected. To thriving despite him. As the evening wound down and the women prepared to leave, Karen realized how much her definition of family had changed. She'd spent 23 years trying to build a life with someone who was fundamentally incapable of genuine intimacy. Now she was surrounded by women who understood her in ways Michael never could have. Karen, Sarah said as she gathered her coat, I need to apologize again. If I hadn't gotten involved with Michael, you would have been another victim and I might never have learned the truth, Karen interrupted. You saved me, Sarah. You saved all of us by being brave enough to tell me what was happening. After everyone left, Karen walked through her house now, and marveled at how different it felt. The rooms that had once seemed hollow and lifeless now felt full of possibility. She was 47 years old, divorced and starting over, but she felt more hopeful about the future than she had in years. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rodriguez. Wanted you to know. 3 more women have come forward after seeing the news coverage. Michael's case is growing, and it looks like the pattern goes back even further than we thought. Karen set down her phone and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at her garden where the roses lay dormant beneath a blanket of snow. In the spring, they would bloom again, and so would she. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, dutiful, accommodating, willing to ignore her instincts to maintain peace. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more aware, and infinitely more honest with herself about what she deserved from life. Michael had spent years constructing elaborate deceptions, but the truth had a power all its own. It had destroyed his carefully built facade, brought justice to his victims, and freed Karen from a marriage that was slowly suffocating her soul. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Her sister Lisa's name appeared on the screen. "How are you holding up?" Lisa asked, her voice warm with concern. "Better than I expected," Karen said, surprising herself with how true that was. "I'm thinking about selling the house, maybe moving somewhere new, starting completely fresh." "That sounds healthy. Any idea where you might go?" Karen looked out at the snowy landscape, then at the dining room where she'd shared dinner with her new chosen family. "Actually, I'm thinking I might stay in Chicago. I found some really good people here. Maybe it's time to build a life based on who I really am, not who someone else wanted me to be." As she ended the call with her sister, Karen felt a sense of completion. The legal proceedings would continue. Michael would face trial and likely spend years in prison. and she would continue healing from the trauma of discovering that her marriage had been built on lies. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt truly at peace. She had survived the worst betrayal she could imagine and emerged not just intact, but stronger. She had helped expose a predator and protect other women from his manipulation. She had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Most importantly, she had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. For years, she had been lonely in her marriage, isolated by Michael's deceptions and emotional unavailability. Now she was alone by choice, surrounded by genuine connections and authentic relationships. As she prepared for bed in the master bedroom she now occupied without apology or compromise, Karen reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. Sarah Chen's unexpected visit had been the catalyst for everything that followed: the discovery of Michael's affairs, the uncovering of his criminal behavior, the collapse of a marriage that had never been as real as she'd believed. But it had also been the beginning of her real life, the one where she no longer had to pretend or accommodate, or make excuses for someone else's failures. She was Karen Matthews, not Michael's wife, not a victim, but a woman who had faced the truth and chosen to build something better from the wreckage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged, in her own home, surrounded by the truth, ready for whatever came next. Spring arrived early in Chicago that year, and Karen found herself spending more time in her garden than she had in years. The roses she'd planted during her marriage were showing new growth, their green shoots pushing through the soil with determined optimism. She'd added new varieties over the winter, hardier plants that could withstand harsh conditions and still produce beautiful blooms. 6 months had passed since Michael's trial began, and the media attention had finally started to fade. He'd been sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, extortion and stalking, with the judge noting the calculated and predatory nature of his crimes. The other victims had received restitution payments from the sale of his assets, though Karen knew money couldn't undo the emotional damage he'd caused. She was kneeling among her flower beds on a Saturday morning in May when she heard footsteps on the garden path. Sarah approached carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a smile that had become genuinely warm over the months they'd grown closer. "Thought you might need a break," Sarah said, settling onto the wooden bench Karen had recently installed near the roses. "Thanks." Karen accepted the coffee gratefully and sat beside her. "How did your meeting with the publisher go yesterday?" Sarah's smile widened. "They want the book. They think the story of how we all came together after Michael's arrest will resonate with readers, especially women who've been in similar situations." Over the winter, Sarah had been working on a book about their experience, not just the trauma of Michael's deceptions, but the unexpected sisterhood that had emerged from their shared ordeal. She'd interviewed all the victims, weaving their stories together into a narrative about survival, healing, and the power of women supporting each other. "That's wonderful," Karen said. "What did they say about the title?" "They love the Notebook Chronicles. It captures both the evidence that brought him down and the way we've rewritten our own stories." Karen sipped her coffee and looked around the garden she'd been transforming. "It's strange how different everything feels now. A year ago I was so focused on maintaining appearances, keeping everything perfect. Now I actually enjoy getting my hands dirty." "Literally and metaphorically," Sarah laughed. "Speaking of which, have you decided about the job offer?" The previous week, Karen had been approached by the Chicago Coalition Against Domestic Violence to head their new fraud and financial abuse prevention program. The position would involve creating educational materials, training counselors, and advocating for policy changes to better protect victims of financial manipulation. "I think I'm going to take it," Karen said. "It feels like a way to turn everything we went through into something meaningful." "Michael would hate knowing his crimes led to you helping other women avoid the same trap." "Michael's feelings stopped being my concern the day he chose to bring you into our bedroom," Karen replied, surprised by how matter-of-fact her tone had become. The anger that had initially consumed her had transformed into something more productive, a determination to prevent other women from experiencing what they'd all gone through. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching a cardinal build its nest in the cherry tree near Karen's back fence. The bird worked with focused determination, weaving together twigs and grass into something that would shelter its family. "Karen," Sarah said eventually, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever miss being married?" Not to Michael specifically, but the idea of having someone to share your life with. Karen considered the question seriously. She'd been asked variations of it by well-meaning friends and family members who seemed to assume that divorce at 47 meant accepting a life of loneliness. "I miss the idea I had of marriage," she said finally. "The partnership, the shared goals, the feeling that someone truly knew and accepted me. But I realize now that I never actually had those things with Michael. I was married to a performance, not a person." "What about dating? Have you thought about it?" "Not really. I'm still learning who I am outside of that relationship. For over 20 years, I defined myself largely in relation to Michael, as his wife, as half of a couple, as someone whose job it was to support his career and maintain his comfort. I'm enjoying discovering what I want, what I like, what makes me happy, without having to consider someone else's needs." Sarah nodded. "I understand that. I've been thinking similarly about my own situation." "How are things with James?" Karen asked, referring to the therapist Sarah had been dating for the past few months. "Good. Really good, actually. But I'm taking it very slowly. Michael destroyed my ability to trust my own judgment about men. I need time to rebuild that." A car door slammed in the driveway, followed by the sound of footsteps on the front walkway. Karen checked her watch, noon exactly, which meant Amy Kellerman had arrived for their monthly book club meeting. What had started as a support group for Michael's victims had evolved into something more social and forward-looking. "I should go let her in," Karen said, but before she could stand, Amy appeared around the side of the house, carrying a bag of groceries and grinning widely. "Don't get up," Amy called out. "I figured I'd find you back here. Beautiful garden, by the way. You've really transformed this space." Amy had transformed as well over the past months. The scared, financially struggling woman Karen had met at the police station had been replaced by someone confident and purposeful. She'd used her experience with Michael to pivot her marketing career toward helping non-profits reach vulnerable populations with protective messaging. "How was your week?" Sarah asked as Amy settled into one of the other garden chairs Karen had added to create a proper conversation area. "Busy, but good. I've been working with a women's shelter on their social media strategy. It's amazing how many red flags about financial abuse we can work into educational content that doesn't feel preachy." Amy pulled a bottle of wine from her grocery bag. "I brought something to celebrate. I got confirmation that my ex-husband finalized the child support payments he'd been avoiding. Turns out, having your story in the news makes deadbeat dads more motivated to meet their obligations." They were joined shortly by Jennifer Walsh and Laura Santos, completing their regular group. What struck Karen most about these gatherings was how different they felt from the social obligations of her married life. With Michael, social events had always carried an undercurrent of performance. She'd been expected to play the role of the successful executive's charming wife, making conversation and managing impressions. These women knew her story, her failures, her struggles, and her strengths. There was no pretense, no carefully maintained facades, just authentic connection among people who'd survived similar experiences and chosen to build something positive from the wreckage. "I have news," Jennifer announced, as they settled in with wine and the salads Amy had brought. "I've been accepted into the master's program at DePaul. I'm going to study counseling psychology with a focus on trauma recovery." The group erupted in congratulations. Jennifer had been the youngest of Michael's victims and had initially been devastated by the experience. But over the past months, she'd channeled her healing process into academic preparation, determined to help other women navigate similar situations. "This calls for a toast," Laura said, raising her glass, "to Jennifer's new chapter and to all of us for refusing to let one man's toxicity define our futures." As they clinked glasses, Karen felt a profound sense of gratitude for these women who had entered her life through such dark circumstances, but brought so much light. They'd all been selected by Michael because he'd perceived them as vulnerable and isolated. Instead, they'd found strength in each other and community in their shared determination to heal. "I've been thinking," Amy said after they'd toasted Jennifer's achievement, "about something that happened this week. A friend of mine mentioned she was dating someone new, and I found myself automatically asking the kinds of questions we've learned to ask, about his job, his living situation, whether his stories were consistent. She got annoyed and said I was being paranoid." "What did you tell her?" Sarah asked. "That paranoia is just pattern recognition based on experience. We're not paranoid, we're educated." Karen nodded. "I've had similar conversations. People who haven't experienced this kind of manipulation think we're being overly cautious or cynical about relationships. They don't understand that we're not afraid of love, we're afraid of deception. There's a difference between being open to connection and being naive about red flags, Laura added. Michael counted on our willingness to overlook inconsistencies, to give him the benefit of the doubt, to prioritize his feelings over our own instincts. As the afternoon progressed, they moved from Michael-related discussions to broader topics: Jennifer's graduate school plans, Amy's growing consulting business, Laura's non-profit work, Sarah's book progress, and Karen's upcoming career change. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and the easy camaraderie of women who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Around 4 o'clock, as they were cleaning up the lunch dishes, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and froze, her face suddenly pale. "What is it?" Karen asked. "It's from the victim's advocate at the prosecutor's office. Michael's been denied parole eligibility. He'll serve his full 8-year sentence." The news created a moment of silence among the group. Even though they'd all moved forward with their lives, Michael's presence loomed in the background like a storm cloud that might someday return. "How do you feel about that?" Jennifer asked. "Relieved," Sarah said immediately, "and guilty about feeling relieved." "Don't feel guilty," Amy said firmly. "He made choices that hurt multiple people over many years. 8 years is actually a light sentence for what he did." Karen found herself thinking about Michael for the first time in weeks. She'd worked hard to eliminate him from her daily thoughts, focusing instead on building her new life. But the reminder of his continued imprisonment brought up complex emotions she'd thought she'd resolved. "I don't think about him much anymore," she said slowly. "But when I do, I mostly feel sad for him. Not because I think his punishment is unfair, but because he chose such a destructive path when he could have had a genuinely good life." "You mean if he'd been honest with you about what he wanted?" Laura asked. "Maybe. Or if he'd ended our marriage before starting other relationships. Or if he'd dealt with whatever psychological issues drove him to manipulate and exploit women." Karen paused, considering her words carefully. "I think Michael is fundamentally broken in some way that made it impossible for him to have authentic relationships. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it makes me grateful that I escaped before he completely destroyed my ability to trust and connect with others." After her friends left that evening, Karen sat alone in her garden as the sun set behind the trees. She thought about the conversation about Michael, but also about the life she'd built since his arrest, the job offer, the friendships, the sense of purpose she'd found in transforming her trauma into advocacy for others. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Her sister Lisa's name appeared on the screen. "How was book club?" Lisa asked, after they exchanged greetings. "Good. Really good, actually. Sarah got a publishing deal for her book. Jennifer was accepted into grad school, and we got word that Michael was denied parole. How do you feel about that last part?" "Honestly, like a chapter of my life is finally completely closed. He can't hurt any of us anymore, and we've all moved on to building better lives. I'm proud of you, Karen. When you first told me about the affair, I was worried about how you'd handle everything. But you've turned a devastating situation into something positive, not just for yourself, but for other women too." After ending the call, Karen walked through her house, turning on lights against the gathering darkness. Each room reflected the changes she'd made since becoming the sole occupant. Brighter colors, more comfortable furniture, artwork that reflected her own taste rather than compromised choices made with Michael. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of wine and opened the folder containing materials about her new job. Reading about the coalition's mission and programs, she felt excited about the work ahead. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to Monday morning. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Thank you for today, and thank you for everything over the past year. I know none of us would have survived this as well without your strength and leadership." Karen smiled and typed back, "Thank you for having the courage to tell me the truth. Everything good in my life now started with that moment." As she prepared for bed that night, Karen reflected on how dramatically her definition of strength had evolved. A year ago, she'd thought strength meant maintaining a perfect facade, keeping problems private, and sacrificing her own needs to preserve her marriage. Now she understood that real strength meant facing difficult truths, setting firm boundaries, and building authentic connections based on honesty rather than performance. She was 48 years old, divorced, and living alone. By many conventional measures, Her life could be seen as a failure or a tragedy. But as she turned off the lights and climbed into her bed in her house, surrounded by her choices, Karen felt more successful than she ever had as Michael's wife. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged, and for the first time in decades, that was enough. 1 year after Michael's sentencing, Karen stood before a packed auditorium at Northwestern University, delivering the keynote address for a conference on financial abuse and intimate partner violence. Her new role at the Chicago Coalition Against Domestic Violence had evolved beyond her initial job description. She'd become a sought-after speaker, policy advocate, and the face of a growing movement to recognize financial manipulation as a serious form of domestic abuse. Financial abuse affects nearly 99% of domestic violence cases, she told the audience of social workers, attorneys, and law enforcement officers. But it's often the least understood and most difficult to prosecute form of intimate partner violence. She clicked to her next slide, showing statistics about economic control and its long-term impact on victims. Abusers use money as a weapon, controlling access to bank accounts, running up debt in their partner's name, preventing them from working, or using financial obligations to maintain power even after the relationship ends. From the podium, she could see Sarah in the third row taking notes for a follow-up article she was writing about the conference. Sarah's book had been published 6 months earlier and become a bestseller, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities with organizations working to prevent romance fraud. What makes financial abuse particularly insidious is how it can be disguised as caring or protection, Karen continued. An abuser might say they're handling the finances to reduce their partner's stress, or that they're making investments for the family's future. The victim often doesn't realize they're being controlled until they try to leave and discover they have no access to resources. During the question and answer session, a young woman in the back raised her hand. What advice would you give to someone who suspects they're being financially manipulated but isn't sure? Karen leaned forward, remembering her own years of uncertainty and self-doubt. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about your financial situation, if you feel confused about where money is going or why you can't access accounts that should be joint, pay attention to those feelings. Document everything you can and reach out for help from organizations like ours that can provide guidance without judgment. Another hand went up. How do you rebuild financially after this kind of abuse? It's challenging, Karen admitted. You may discover hidden debt, damaged credit, or assets that have been secretly liquidated, but financial recovery is possible with the right support and legal advocacy. More importantly, you rebuild your sense of agency and control over your own economic future. After the conference, Karen joined Sarah and several other attendees for dinner at a nearby restaurant. The conversation was animated, focused on policy changes needed to better protect victims and prosecute perpetrators of financial abuse. Your presentation was incredible, said Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a researcher from the University of Illinois. Have you considered writing a book about your experience? There's such a need for first-person accounts that can help both victims and professionals understand the dynamics. Karen glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. I've thought about it, but I'm not sure I'm ready to revisit everything in that much detail. What if you approached it as a collaborative project? Sarah suggested. Multiple perspectives from the same case, your experience as the spouse, my experience as the other woman, testimonies from the other victims, maybe input from the law enforcement officers and attorneys who worked the case. The idea intrigued Karen. Over the past year, she'd spoken with hundreds of women who'd experienced various forms of intimate partner abuse, and she'd noticed how many of them felt isolated by their experiences. A comprehensive account of Michael's case might help others recognize similar patterns and understand that they weren't alone. I'll think about it, she said, meaning it. As they left the restaurant, Sarah walked with Karen toward the parking garage where they'd both left their cars. Can I ask you something? Sarah said. Do you ever think about dating again? Karen smiled. The question had been coming up more frequently lately, from friends, family members, and even some of the women she counseled through her work. Honestly, I'm open to the possibility, but I'm not actively looking. What would it take for you to feel ready? I think I already am ready in some ways. I've done the therapy, I understand the red flags. I have a strong sense of my own worth independent of a romantic relationship. Karen paused at her car. But I also know that the right person would need to be someone who understood and respected my experience, someone who didn't see my caution as paranoia or my independence as unwillingness to commit. That person exists, Sarah said confidently. When you're ready, you'll find each other. Driving home through the Chicago streets she'd come to know so well, Karen reflected on how much her life had changed. The scared, confused woman who had first met with Detective Rodriguez felt like someone from another lifetime. That woman had been defined by her relationship to Michael, uncertain of her own judgment, afraid to trust her instincts. The woman she'd become was defined by her own choices and values. She had work that mattered, friendships based on authenticity rather than social obligation, and a clear sense of her own worth. If the right romantic relationship came along, it would be an addition to an already fulfilling life, not a desperate attempt to fill an empty space. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. Amy Kellerman's name appeared on the screen. "How did the keynote go?" Amy asked immediately. "Really well. Great questions from the audience, and there's interest in expanding the program to more universities." Karen gathered her materials from the passenger seat. "How was your day?" "Productive. I met with that non-profit in Milwaukee about developing their fraud prevention campaign, and I have some news. I'm seeing someone." Karen smiled as she unlocked her front door. Over the past year, Amy had been the most reluctant of their group to consider dating again, claiming she needed at least 5 years to trust her judgment about men. "Tell me everything," Karen said, settling into her living room chair. "His name is David. He's a social worker at the Children's Hospital, and we met at a conference last month. He's funny, genuine, and when I told him about what happened with Michael, he didn't try to minimize it or rush me past it. He asked thoughtful questions and said he was grateful I'd shared something so personal with him. He sounds wonderful. How do you feel?" "Terrified and excited in equal measure," Amy laughed. "But good terrified, if that makes sense. Like I'm scared because this matters, not because I'm ignoring warning signs." After they hung up, Karen walked through her house, noting all the ways it had evolved to reflect her preferences and personality. The neutral colors Michael had insisted on had been replaced with warm earth tones and rich blues. The formal living room they'd rarely used had been converted into a home office where she could work on advocacy projects and victim assistance cases. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of wine and opened her laptop to review her notes from the conference. But instead of working, she found herself thinking about Sarah's suggestion regarding a collaborative book project. She opened a new document and began typing. "My name is Karen Matthews, and for 23 years, I was married to a man I thought I knew. The discovery of his affairs was devastating, but it was only the beginning. What we uncovered in the aftermath was a pattern of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and criminal behavior that had affected multiple women over many years." She paused, rereading the opening sentences. They felt honest, but not victim-focused, strong, but not angry. She continued writing. "This is not just a story about infidelity or divorce. It's about the way financial abuse operates in relationships, how predators use emotional manipulation to exploit vulnerable people, and how a group of women found strength in truth-telling and mutual support." By midnight, she'd written 12 pages, not a complete chapter, but a solid beginning that captured both the personal trauma and broader social implications of their experience. She saved the document and closed her laptop, feeling energized rather than drained by the writing process. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call. Detective Rodriguez, whom she'd stayed in touch with over the past year, called with news about Michael's case. "I wanted to let you know that 3 more women have come forward with complaints against your ex-husband," the detective said. "These are cases from before he moved to Chicago, dating back to his college years." Karen felt a familiar mixture of sadness and vindication. Each new victim who came forward confirmed that Michael's behavior hadn't been an aberration or a midlife crisis, but a decades-long pattern of predatory behavior. What will happen with these new cases? The statute of limitations has expired on most of the potential criminal charges, but the women are considering civil suits. Their attorneys may want to speak with you and the other victims about establishing a pattern of behavior. Of course, whatever they need. Karen, I want you to know that your decision to pursue an aggressive divorce strategy, to refuse his settlement offers and demand full disclosure, that decision broke this case open. If you'd accepted his initial offers and agreed to sealed proceedings, he'd probably still be out there victimizing women. After ending the call, Karen sat in her garden with her morning coffee, thinking about the detective's words. She'd made those decisions out of anger and hurt, not from any noble desire to protect other women. But the outcome had been the same. A dangerous predator had been stopped, and his victims had found justice and community. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. "Saw your keynote mentioned in the Tribune this morning. Proud of you." The article was brief but positive, highlighting the conference and quoting several of Karen's key points about financial abuse. She was mentioned as a survivor advocate whose own experience with intimate partner financial abuse led her to become a leading voice for policy reform. Reading about herself in those terms still felt surreal. A year and a half ago, she'd been a non-profit program coordinator, leading a quiet, conventional life. Now she was a public figure in the domestic violence prevention community, someone whose opinion was sought by policymakers and journalists. But the transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. She'd spent months in therapy working through not just the trauma of Michael's betrayal, but the deeper questions about her own identity and value. She'd had to learn to trust her judgment again, to set boundaries, and to distinguish between genuine connection and manipulation. Most importantly, she'd had to forgive herself for missing the signs, for staying in a marriage that felt increasingly hollow, for prioritizing peace over truth for so many years. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Through the peephole, she could see a delivery person holding a large floral arrangement. The flowers were beautiful, white roses mixed with eucalyptus and baby's breath. The card read, "Congratulations on yesterday's keynote. Your courage continues to inspire. The team at Chicago Coalition." Karen arranged the flowers in a vase and placed them on her kitchen table, then took a photo to share with her support group's text chain. Within minutes, her phone was buzzing with congratulatory messages from Sarah, Amy, Jennifer, and Laura. These women had become her chosen family, connected not by blood or marriage, but by shared experience and mutual support. They celebrated each other's successes, provided comfort during difficult moments, and served as witnesses to each other's growth and healing. As she prepared for her workday, Karen reflected on how different her life looked from what she'd imagined 2 years earlier. She'd thought she'd be celebrating her 25th wedding anniversary soon, maybe planning for retirement with Michael, possibly becoming a grandmother if they'd been blessed with children. Instead, she was single, childless, starting over professionally in her late 40s. By many conventional measures, her life could be seen as a series of losses and failures. But standing in her kitchen, surrounded by flowers from colleagues who respected her work, preparing for a job that gave her purpose and meaning, connected to a community of women who truly understood her, Karen felt more successful than she ever had as Michael's wife. She had learned that happiness wasn't about meeting other people's expectations or maintaining a perfect facade. It was about living authentically, contributing meaningfully to others' well-being, and building relationships based on truth rather than convenience. Her phone rang as she was gathering her work materials. The caller ID showed her divorce attorney Rebecca Walsh, whom she'd stayed in touch with occasionally for professional consultations. "Karen, I have some interesting news. Michael's attorney has reached out about a potential interview request. Apparently a documentary filmmaker wants to make a film about the case, and they're interested in including perspectives from all parties involved." "Including Michael?" "He'd be interviewed from prison, yes. But you and the other victims would have editorial control over your own participation. No one could use your story without your explicit consent." Karen considered the proposal. Part of her recoiled at the idea of Michael having any platform to tell his version of events, but another part recognized the educational value of a comprehensive examination of how financial and emotional abuse operated in relationships. "What do the others think?" "I haven't contacted them yet. I wanted to get your initial reaction first, since you were the catalyst for the entire investigation. Let me talk to Sarah and the others. If we do this, we do it together, and we make sure the focus stays on prevention and victim support, not on sensationalizing Michael's crimes." That sounds like a reasonable approach. As Karen drove to work that morning, she found herself thinking about the strange twists her life had taken. From discovering her husband's infidelity to becoming a public advocate for abuse prevention, from feeling isolated and betrayed to finding community and purpose, none of it had been planned or predictable. But that was perhaps the most important lesson she'd learned. Life rarely followed the scripts people tried to write for it. The unexpected could be devastating or liberating, sometimes both simultaneously. The key was learning to adapt, to find meaning in difficult circumstances, and to remain open to possibilities that didn't match original expectations. She was no longer the woman who had opened her door to Sarah Chen 18 months earlier. That woman had been living in a carefully constructed fantasy, prioritizing harmony over honesty, accommodation over authenticity. The woman she'd become was harder in some ways, more suspicious of easy answers and smooth explanations, but she was also more compassionate, more aware of others' pain, more committed to using her own experience to help prevent similar suffering. As she pulled into the parking lot of the coalition offices, Karen realized she was looking forward to the workday ahead, to the clients she would counsel, the policies she would help develop, the difference she might make in someone else's life. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 2 years after Michael's conviction, Karen received an unexpected letter from the Illinois Department of Corrections. She recognized the return address immediately and felt her stomach tighten as she held the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from her ex-husband, the first direct communication they'd had since his sentencing. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the morning sunlight streaming through windows she'd had enlarged as part of her home renovations, and considered whether to read it at all. Her therapist had warned her that Michael might attempt to contact her eventually, either to manipulate her emotions or to seek some form of forgiveness that would ease his own psychological burden. After several minutes of deliberation, she opened the letter. "Karen, I know you have every right not to read this, and I understand if you throw it away without finishing. I've started this letter dozens of times over the past year, trying to find words that could somehow explain or excuse what I did. But I've finally accepted that there are no words that can undo the damage I caused. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm writing because my therapist says I need to take responsibility for my actions without expecting anything in return. So here it is. I destroyed our marriage through my own selfishness and cruelty. I manipulated and exploited women who trusted me. I turned love into a weapon and used intimacy as a tool for control. The man you married was real, Karen, but he was only part of who I was. The other part, the part that felt entitled to whatever I wanted regardless of who it hurt, that was real too. I spent years lying to myself about my motivations, convincing myself that I deserved multiple relationships, that the rules didn't apply to me. Prison has given me time to understand how deeply I was damaged, probably from childhood, and how I let that damage become an excuse to damage others. I'm working with counselors here, not because I think it will reduce my sentence, but because I finally want to understand what made me capable of such cruelty. I know you've built a new life helping other women avoid what I put you through. I read about your work in a newspaper article someone showed me. I'm glad you found a way to turn your pain into purpose. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. I hope someday you can think of the good years we had without the memory being poisoned by what I became. You were never the problem, Karen. You were never lacking in any way. The failure was entirely mine. I won't contact you again unless you initiate it. You've earned your peace. Michael." Karen read the letter twice, surprised by its tone. Gone was the manipulative charm and self-serving justification she'd expected. This felt like genuine remorse, though she remained skeptical about trusting any communication from Michael after everything he'd put her through. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept important documents. She wouldn't respond. Michael had said he didn't expect forgiveness, and she wasn't ready to offer it, even if she believed his contrition was genuine. Later that morning, she called Sarah to tell her about the letter. "How do you feel about it?" Sarah asked, confused, honestly. "Part of me wants to believe he's genuinely changed, but another part remembers how convincing he could be when it served his purposes." Karen walked to her living room window, looking out at the street where she'd rebuilt her life. Maybe it doesn't matter whether his remorse is real. What matters is that he can't hurt anyone else while he's locked up. "Are you going to tell the others?" "I think so. At our next meeting. They should know he's attempting to make amends, even if we collectively decide not to engage with him." That afternoon, Karen met with Dr. Jennifer Morrison, the therapist she'd been seeing regularly since Michael's arrest. They sat in the comfortable office that had become a sanctuary for Karen's healing process. "How did reading his letter make you feel?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Strangely empty," Karen said after considering the question. "A year ago I would have been angry or upset. Now I just feel detached, like it was a letter about someone else's life. That suggests significant healing. You've created enough emotional distance from Michael, and that relationship that his attempts at reconciliation don't destabilize you. Is that healthy? Shouldn't I feel something more? Dr. Morrison leaned forward. Karen, you spent 23 years accommodating Michael's emotions, managing his needs, prioritizing his feelings over your own. The fact that you can receive his letter without being emotionally hijacked by it shows how much you've reclaimed your own emotional autonomy. As summer turned to fall, Karen's life continued evolving in positive directions. The documentary about Michael's case had been completed and was premiering at several film festivals, with Karen and the other victims maintaining editorial control over how their stories were presented. The film focused on the systemic failures that allowed financial abuse to flourish and the importance of believing victims when they came forward. Her book project with Sarah had also progressed, with a publisher expressing serious interest in their collaborative approach to examining the case from multiple perspectives. They'd spent months interviewing each other, the other victims, law enforcement officers, and experts in financial abuse, creating a comprehensive resource for both survivors and professionals. One evening in October, exactly 3 years since Sarah had first appeared at her door with those devastating photographs, Karen was working in her garden when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Mrs. Matthews? She looked up to see Mrs. Patterson from next door walking toward her with a younger woman Karen didn't recognize. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Mrs. Patterson said, "but I wanted you to meet my niece, Janet. She's going through something similar to what you experienced, and I thought perhaps you might be willing to talk with her." Karen invited them both inside, recognizing the haunted look in Janet's eyes that she'd seen in her own mirror 3 years earlier. Over tea in her kitchen, Janet told her story, a marriage that had felt increasingly hollow, a husband whose explanations never quite added up, the growing suspicion that she was being lied to about fundamental aspects of their shared life. "I found credit card statements he'd hidden," Janet said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hotels, restaurants, jewelry stores. When I confronted him, he said it was all for business entertaining, but the charges are always on weekends when he claims to be playing golf." Karen listened without judgment, offering tissues when Janet began crying, sharing her own experience when it seemed helpful. She provided Janet with resources, contact information for attorneys, financial advisors, and support groups, and assured her that whatever she discovered, she wouldn't have to face it alone. "The hardest part," Janet said as she prepared to leave, "is wondering if I'm crazy. He's so convincing when he explains things away. Sometimes I think I'm imagining problems that don't exist." "Trust your instincts," Karen said, walking her to the door. "You know something isn't right, or you wouldn't be looking for answers. Don't let anyone convince you that your intuition is wrong." After Janet and Mrs. Patterson left, Karen sat in her living room thinking about how far she'd come since receiving similar advice from well-meaning friends and family members. She'd gone from being the woman who needed help to being someone who could provide it. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Karen Matthews?" "Yes, this is Karen. My name is David Chen. I'm Sarah's brother. I'm calling because I wanted to thank you." Karen was confused. "Thank me for what?" "For helping my sister heal from what that monster did to her. When Sarah first told our family about the affair and everything that followed, we were worried about her mental health. She was so consumed with guilt and shame, convinced that she'd somehow caused problems in your marriage." Karen felt a pang of sympathy for Sarah, remembering how the younger woman had blamed herself for Michael's deception. But watching her work with you and the other women, seeing her channel that experience into advocacy and writing, it's transformed her. She's stronger now than I've ever seen her, and she's using her pain to help other people. That's because of the example you set. Sarah found her own strength, Karen said. I just helped her see it. That's exactly what I mean. You could have blamed her for disrupting your marriage, but instead you helped her understand that you were both victims of the same predator. That kind of wisdom and compassion, that's extraordinary. After ending the call, Karen realized she felt proud of how she'd handled Sarah's role in the destruction of her marriage. It would have been easy to blame the younger woman, to see her as a homewrecker rather than another victim of Michael's manipulation. But choosing compassion over blame had led to genuine friendship and mutual healing. That weekend, Karen attended Amy Kellerman's wedding to David, the social worker she'd met the previous year. The ceremony was small and intimate, held in a botanical garden with only close friends and family present. Karen sat with Sarah, Jennifer, and Laura, watching their friend exchange vows with a man who clearly understood and respected her journey. "I never thought I'd be able to trust my judgment about men again," Amy had confided to Karen the night before, "but David makes me feel safe to be vulnerable without making me feel naive or stupid for being careful." During the reception, Karen found herself in conversation with David's sister, a family law attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases. "Amy told me about your advocacy work," the attorney said. "I've been following the legislative efforts around financial abuse recognition. The bill you helped draft is brilliant. It closes so many loopholes that abusers have exploited." The legislation Karen had worked on with the coalition would make certain forms of financial abuse criminal offenses and provide better protection for victims seeking to escape economically controlling relationships. It had passed the Illinois legislature and was being considered as a model for other states. "It's amazing how much change can come from one case," the attorney continued. "Your ex-husband's conviction opened up conversations that had been happening in academic and advocacy circles for years, but never got mainstream attention." As Karen drove home from the wedding, she reflected on the strange way trauma could sometimes lead to positive change. Michael's crimes had caused immense pain for her and the other victims, but their collective response had also prevented future crimes and improved resources for other survivors. She thought about the letter Michael had sent, his claim to be working on understanding his own psychological damage. Whether his remorse was genuine or not, the fact remained that his actions had inadvertently created a network of strong women committed to preventing similar abuse. That night she opened her laptop and added another chapter to the book she and Sarah were writing. Recovery from intimate partner abuse is not linear. Some days you feel strong and confident in your new life. Other days you question every decision and wonder if you overreacted to behaviors that might have been harmless. But healing is not about eliminating all doubt or pain. It's about learning to trust yourself despite uncertainty, to build meaningful connections despite past betrayals, and to find purpose in your survival. As she wrote, Karen realized she was no longer writing primarily about her experience with Michael. She was writing about the life she'd built afterward, the work that gave her meaning, the friendships that sustained her, the ways she'd learned to help other women navigate similar challenges. Michael had been the catalyst for her transformation, but he was no longer the central character in her story. She was. 3 months later, on a cold January morning, Karen received another unexpected phone call. This time it was from the warden at Michael's prison. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm calling to inform you that your ex-husband has been hospitalized. He suffered a heart attack yesterday evening and is in critical condition." Karen felt a complicated mix of emotions, not grief exactly, but a recognition of shared mortality and the final closing of a chapter she'd thought was already finished. "Does he have other family I should contact?" she asked. "His sister in California has been notified. I'm calling because you're still listed as his emergency contact in some of his medical records." "I see. Will he recover?" "It's too early to tell, but I thought you should know, given your history." After ending the call, Karen sat quietly in her office at the coalition, processing the news. She found herself remembering not the man who had betrayed and manipulated her, but the young man she'd fallen in love with 30 years earlier. Before the lies and deception, before the criminal behavior, there had been genuine moments of connection and happiness. She realized she could hold both truths simultaneously, that Michael had caused tremendous harm and that he had once been capable of love and kindness. His potential for good made his choices more tragic, not less culpable. That evening she called Sarah to share the news. "How are you feeling about it?" Sarah asked. "Sad, but not devastated. It's like hearing about a natural disaster in a place you used to live. You feel sympathy for the people affected, but you're grateful not to be there anymore." 2 days later, the warden called again to inform her that Michael had died without regaining consciousness. Karen felt a profound sense of finality, not closure exactly, because she'd already found that in her own healing process, but recognition that the last thread connecting her to that painful chapter of her life had been severed. She attended the funeral service, not out of love or forgiveness, but as a witness to the end of a story that had shaped multiple lives. Michael's sister thanked her for coming, expressing regret for the pain her brother had caused. "He talked about you sometimes in his letters," the sister said. I think he knew he'd lost the best thing in his life when he lost you. Sarah, Amy, Jennifer, and Laura all attended the service with Karen, providing support not because they mourned Michael's death, but because they understood the complex emotions his passing might evoke for her. As they left the cemetery together, Karen felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The man who had dominated so many years of her life, first through marriage and then through the process of seeking justice for his crimes, was gone. The space he'd occupied in her consciousness could now be filled with more positive influences. "What happens now?" Jennifer asked, as they shared a quiet lunch after the service. "Now we keep living," Karen said. "We keep working to help other women. We keep building the lives we want. We remember that our stories didn't end with Michael. They began when we chose to survive him." That evening, Karen sat in her garden despite the winter cold, wrapped in a warm coat and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3.5 years ago, she'd been living a lie without knowing it. Now she was living a truth that sometimes felt harder, but was infinitely more authentic. Her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Matthews, this is Janet Patterson. I wanted you to know that I filed for divorce today. Thank you for helping me find the courage. Your story gave me hope that there's life after this kind of betrayal." Karen smiled and typed back, "You're going to be okay. Better than okay. You're going to discover strengths you didn't know you had. I'm here if you need support." As she prepared for bed that night, Karen reflected on how completely her life had changed. She was 50 years old, single, and childless, circumstances that might have seemed tragic to her younger self. But she was also purposeful, connected to meaningful work and authentic relationships, and more content than she'd ever been during her marriage. Michael's death marked the end of one story, but Karen understood that her real story was just beginning. She had decades ahead of her to continue growing, contributing and building the life she truly wanted, rather than the one she thought she was supposed to have. For the first time in years, that prospect filled her with excitement rather than fear. 5 years after Sarah Chen first knocked on her door with photographs that shattered her world, Karen Matthews stood at the podium of the United Nations headquarters in New York City. She was addressing the Commission on the Status of Women about the global epidemic of intimate partner financial abuse, representing not just the Chicago Coalition, but an international network of survivor advocates she'd helped establish. "Economic violence is often the thread that weaves through all forms of intimate partner abuse," she told the assembly of delegates from around the world. "When we address financial control and manipulation, we provide victims with the practical tools they need to escape dangerous relationships and rebuild their lives." The speech was being live-streamed to audiences in 30 countries, translated into multiple languages, and would later be incorporated into UN policy recommendations for member nations. Karen had come to represent something larger than her individual story. She embodied the possibility of transforming personal trauma into global change. In the audience, she could see Sarah, now an internationally recognized expert on romance fraud, who had testified before Congress and consulted with law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. Their book, The Notebook Chronicles, How One Man's Crimes Revealed the Hidden Epidemic of Financial Abuse, had become a standard text in criminology and social work programs worldwide. After her presentation, Karen was approached by Dr. Amara Okafor, a researcher from the University of Cape Town who was studying financial abuse patterns in sub-Saharan Africa. "Your framework for understanding economic coercion has been invaluable for our work," Dr. Okafor said. "But I wanted to ask about something more personal. How do you maintain hope while working so closely with trauma every day?" Karen considered the question, one she'd been asked frequently as her profile as an advocate had grown. "I've learned that hope isn't a feeling, it's a practice. Every woman I help recognize the warning signs, every policy that gets changed, every time someone finds the courage to leave an abusive situation because of resources we've created, that's hope in action." That evening, Karen attended a reception at the American delegation's residence, mingling with diplomats, advocates, and researchers from around the world. The conversation was stimulating, focused on strategies for combating gender-based violence through economic empowerment and legal reform. She was in the middle of a discussion about microfinance programs for domestic violence survivors when her phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Watching your UN speech online, David and I are so proud of you. Also, I'm pregnant, due in September." Karen smiled, stepping away from the conversation to respond with congratulations. Amy's journey from Michael's victim to successful consultant to happy wife and now expectant mother represented the kind of complete life transformation that made Karen's advocacy work feel worthwhile. As the evening wound down, Karen found herself on the residence's terrace overlooking the East River, talking with Maria Santos, a Spanish prosecutor who had used Karen's research to secure convictions in several high-profile financial abuse cases. "There's something I've been curious about," Maria said. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have looked like if you'd never discovered your husband's crimes?" "Sometimes," Karen admitted. "I probably would have stayed married, maybe forever. I might have retired from my old job, focused on being a good wife and grandmother. If we'd been blessed with children, it would have been a quieter life, certainly less complicated. Do you regret the path that brought you here?" Karen looked out at the lights of Manhattan, thinking about the questions seriously. "I regret the pain that Michael caused, not just to me, but to all his victims. I regret the years I spent living a lie, even though I didn't know it at the time. But I can't regret where those experiences led me. This work, these connections, the knowledge that I've helped prevent other women from going through what we went through, I wouldn't trade that for anything." The next morning, Karen took the train back to Chicago, watching the familiar landscape roll past and reflecting on how surreal her life had become. She was returning from addressing world leaders to her modest home in a quiet suburb, from discussing international policy to her regular Thursday afternoon support group meeting. But that contrast no longer felt jarring. She'd learned to inhabit multiple identities simultaneously: the global advocate and the local counselor, the public speaker, and the private individual still working through her own healing process. Her phone rang as the train pulled into Union Station. Jennifer Walsh's name appeared on the screen. "Karen, I just finished defending my doctoral dissertation. I'm officially Dr. Jennifer Walsh now. Congratulations. How did it go?" "Better than I expected. The committee was especially interested in the section about trauma-informed approaches to financial abuse counseling. I cited your work extensively." Jennifer had completed her PhD in counseling psychology with a specialization in intimate partner violence, writing her dissertation on the long-term psychological effects of economic abuse. She'd already accepted a position at a university research center focused on gender-based violence prevention. "I have news too," Karen said. "I've been offered a position with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, developing their new initiative on economic violence. I'd be based in Vienna for 2 years, helping create international protocols for investigating and prosecuting financial abuse cases." "That's incredible. Are you going to take it?" "I think so. It feels like the natural evolution of everything I've been working toward." As she walked through Union Station toward the taxi stand, Karen thought about how the decision to accept the UN position represented another major life transition. At 51, she would be moving to a foreign country, starting over once again, but this time from a position of strength and clarity about her purpose. Her Thursday support group meeting that afternoon was particularly meaningful, knowing it might be one of her last as a regular facilitator. She sat in the circle with 8 women in various stages of recovering from intimate partner abuse, sharing their struggles and victories with the honesty that had become the hallmark of these sessions. "I've been thinking about forgiveness lately," said Marie, a newer group member whose husband had financially destroyed her through gambling addiction and hidden debt. "Not forgiveness of him, I'm nowhere near ready for that, but forgiveness of myself for not seeing what was happening sooner." The comment sparked a discussion that reminded Karen of her own journey towards self-forgiveness. For years after Michael's arrest, she'd berated herself for missing the warning signs, for enabling his deception through her desire to maintain harmony in their marriage. "Self-forgiveness isn't about letting yourself off the hook," Karen told the group. "It's about accepting that you made the best decisions you could with the information you had at the time. Your abuser's job was to keep you from seeing the full picture." After the meeting, Karen walked to her car thinking about how much these weekly gatherings had meant to her recovery. They'd started as a way to process her own trauma, but they'd evolved into something more significant: a laboratory for understanding how financial abuse operated and how survivors could most effectively heal from it. That weekend, Karen hosted a farewell dinner at her house for her closest friends and supporters. Sarah, Amy, and David, Jennifer, Laura, and several colleagues from the coalition gathered in the dining room where she'd once confronted Michael with evidence of his affairs. "It's poetic," Sarah observed, looking around the room. "This is where everything started in a way, where you first chose to face the truth instead of accepting comfortable lies." Karen raised her wineglass. "To uncomfortable truths and the courage to act on them." As they ate and talked, Karen felt a profound sense of gratitude for the community she'd built from the wreckage of her marriage. These people had sustained her through the darkest period of her life and celebrated her emergence as someone stronger and more purposeful than she'd ever imagined she could be. "What will you miss most about Chicago?" Amy asked. "This," Karen said, gesturing around the table. "Having you all close by, being able to see you regularly, feeling like we're all part of each other's daily lives. We'll visit you in Vienna," Laura promised, "and you'll be back for conferences and speaking engagements. Plus, your work there will help women all over the world, not just in one city." After her friends left that evening, Karen walked through her house, noting all the changes she'd made over the past 5 years. Every room reflected her journey from Michael's wife to her own person. Bolder colors, more comfortable furniture, artwork that spoke to her rather than what looked appropriately sophisticated. She'd decided to rent the house rather than sell it, keeping it as a home base she could return to when her UN assignment ended. The decision felt right. This house had been the site of tremendous pain, but also of remarkable healing and growth. Her phone rang, showing an unknown international number. "Mrs. Matthews, this is Dr. Elena Petrov from the University of Geneva. I wanted to call personally to welcome you to Europe and discuss some collaborative opportunities for your time in Vienna." Over the next hour, Karen found herself planning research projects and policy initiatives that would occupy her for years to come. The conversation was energizing, full of possibilities she couldn't have imagined when she was living her quiet life as Michael's dutiful wife. 3 weeks later, Karen stood in the Vienna International Airport, looking around at signs in German and feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness about the adventure ahead. At 51, she was beginning another new chapter, but this time, as someone who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted to contribute to the world. Her phone buzzed with a group text from her Chicago support network. "Safe travels. Vienna is lucky to have you. You're going to change the world." As she settled into her seat for the flight to her new temporary home, Karen opened her laptop and began working on her next project, a comprehensive manual for law enforcement agencies investigating intimate partner financial abuse. The dedication page was already written. "To the women who found strength in truth-telling, community in shared trauma, and purpose in preventing others from suffering what we survived, your courage continues to inspire." Looking out the airplane window as Vienna came into view, Karen reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 5.5 years ago, she'd thought her life was over when Sarah Chen appeared at her door with those devastating photographs. She'd believed that discovering Michael's betrayal meant accepting a future of diminished possibilities and reduced expectations. Instead, she discovered that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing that can happen to you. Michael's crimes had destroyed the life she thought she wanted, but they'd also revealed the life she actually needed, one built on truth rather than illusion, on authentic connection rather than performance, on meaningful work rather than comfortable routine. As the plane began its descent into Vienna, Karen felt a familiar sense of anticipation about the unknown future ahead. She'd learned that uncertainty could be a gift rather than a curse, an invitation to discover strengths and possibilities she'd never imagined. The woman who had opened her door to Sarah Chen all those years ago could never have envisioned addressing the United Nations, authoring international policy recommendations, or relocating to Europe to lead a global initiative against gender-based violence. But that woman had possessed something crucial, the willingness to face difficult truths and the courage to act on them. Everything else had grown from that fundamental decision to choose reality over comfort, growth over stagnation, purpose over security. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, Karen smiled at the thought of the adventures waiting ahead. At 51, she was just beginning to understand what she was truly capable of accomplishing. The best was yet to come.